Um, Brian, can you get started? Okay. Hi, everyone. A very warm welcome to Clear South Asia's panel on evaluating SDGs for the world we want, measurement, innovations, and challenges. So it was, my name is Sohini. I'm a Senior Capacity Building Manager at Clear South Asia. Thank you so much for joining the session. And it was actually 8 years back in the month of September that 193 world leaders came together for the global goal for sustainable development. So as we are moving towards the midpoint to the 2030 agenda, I think it is extremely crucial that we take a pause and think about strengthening our monitoring and evaluation systems to understand the progress to SDGs. So, so we at Clear South Asia, we are a core implementing partner to Global Evaluation Initiative. So Global Evaluation Initiative, just very quickly for those of you who don't know, it's actually a global partnership of M&E providers that work around the world, and it is co-led by UNDP and at IG at World Bank. And we at Clear South Asia, we have been around for more than a decade in the region, and we work more broadly at 3 levels. So, and this is all towards strengthening M&E to a more, to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So our work at the enabling environmental level is on strengthening M&E systems. We also work with organizations, and here particularly we work a lot with governments, both at the central level as well as at the line ministries, to be able to address the M&E challenges that the policymakers are facing. And then at the individual level, we also work on the policy questions that the policymaker face on a regular basis. So our work more broadly is around targets 8, 14, 15, and 18 of Goal 17, with an overarching impact that spans across the 16 goals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the government work that we have been doing on this issue. And I think the case in point is the work that we are doing with Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office, which is the apex M&E body that is housed within Niti Aayog in India. So Niti Aayog, for those of you who don't know, is actually the nodal authority of Government of India when it comes to SDG implementation. And our work has been, in the last 2-3 years, has been a lot on developing, co-developing the National Evaluation Policy, which is India's first of its kind, which is currently under the review. We are also working a lot on output-outcome monitoring framework, which is, again, something that the Government of India is working towards to evaluate and monitor their national schemes. As well as we are also working on institutionalizing outcome budgeting of the government. I think one important lesson that we have learned as a community, as an evaluation community in the last few years is, when it comes to SDGs, I think the global initiatives also need to be coupled with the local considerations. So we are also working a lot at the state level, and here I want to quickly talk about the work that we are doing with Government of Tamil Nadu, where we are supporting the government's as monitoring and evaluation focused SDG work through developing evaluation guidelines, strengthening M&E systems. The state is also, it has developed towards its broader mission of institutionalizing SDG localization, it has also, set up an SDG coordination center. So we are also working towards some of these aspects. I think one quick point that I also wanted to briefly touch upon, and I think we will talk about a little bit during the panel discussions, is about the data innovation, right? So there is an unprecedented use of data that the work towards, that has happened recently because of the work towards 2030 agenda. And here we are working again with DMU in coming up with a comprehensive plan of action when it comes to use of administrative data. And I remember in yesterday's panel, 3IE was talking about the use of administrative data within the government structure. The government is now moving away from not just moving away, they're also supplementing the traditional use of survey data, and they're also using and leveraging modern technologies and administrative data to take more, to use more evidence in decision making. At the state level, again, with several states, we have been working a lot on use of, on coming up with data policy, on improving the quality of data that the government is using, as well as strengthening data use. And this is also happening simultaneously as well. I think I want to end my opening remarks by talking a little bit about the topic of this panel, which is about measurement of SDGs. So I think on this point, we have come a long way. We started with, now we have 225 indicators. We had about 100 odd indicators in 2016, which are linked to SDG database. I think simultaneously what has also happened is the data set has also simultaneously increased from 100,000 to now we are close to 2.7 million data sets that are linked to this. So there is a lot of work that has happened when it comes to measurement. So there are a lot of indicators that have comparable measures, internationally comparable measures, which makes these comparable, accurate, and reliable. But at the same time, I want to quickly touch upon three, to me, which are three key challenges that are there when it comes to measurement. So I think the first is about the national statistical systems and the challenges that they are facing when it comes to the geographical spread, when it comes to disaggregated data, they still face a lot of challenges. I think secondly, the point that I wanted to touch upon is about some of these cross-sectoral SDGs, which are around gender, climate change, strong institutions. They still face challenges around measurement and how to measure them well. And I think thirdly, what I wanted to quickly touch upon is about the evaluation. So around 140 odd targets which can be evaluated. There are a number of them which are not moving in our desired trajectory. So here I wanted to quote from this year's SDG report, which talks about in a rather ominous tone that the Sustainable Development Goals are disappearing in the rear view mirror, as is the hope and rights of current and future generations. A fundamental shift is needed in commitment, solidarity, and financing and action to put the world on a better path. So in the spirit of commitment and solidarity, our session actually has brought together representatives from UNESCAP, from ADB, from UNDP. We also have one of our colleagues who is a researcher who is joining online to talk and deliberate about the challenges, the opportunities, and the best practices when it comes to measurement of SDGs. So with that, I will close my opening remarks. So the first thing we will do is we'll listen to a recording by Dr. Sabina Al-Khair. She is the professor of Poverty and Human Development, and she directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, at University of Oxford. And they do a lot of work on multidimensional poverty, so I think she would be perfect to talk about some of the measurement challenges that she and her team at OPHI has been thinking about. Yeah.
Greetings. I'm so glad to join with you for this Clear South Asia session in Asia Evaluation Week on evaluating SDGs for the world we want, measurements, innovations, and challenges. And I'm so sorry I cannot join you in person in Bangkok. I look forward to the discussion that ensues and to the interventions of the 4 panelists. What I thought I would do, in a sense, is to stand on the shoulders and share insights on the topic from Sir Tony Atkinson, who, in his posthumous book, Measuring Poverty Around the World, gave very interesting insights on many of the challenges of measurement and the SDGs. He observed that learning about the extent of poverty in the SDGs is important, but what is vital is to link measurement to action. Poverty statistics matter if and when they motivate people who are not experts on poverty measurement to tackle a key challenge. And he begins the book with examples of political leaders who read a book on poverty in their holidays and implemented it when they got back to office. That's the link we're looking for. And his book focuses on poverty, but he recognizes its multidimensional poverty, and he recognizes the SDG framework. And so when he speaks about the SDG targets, 169 of them, he says they couldn't have taken place without the possibility of providing quantitative evidence on progress. If we could not monitor the SDGs, for example, poverty in all its forms and dimensions, a political commitment to the SDGs would have no force. We need to know if there has been success, and measurement diagnoses that. And so he observes that statistics in this sense and SDG indicators are a performance indicator, and that this role of performance indicator monitoring has a much greater salience in the SDG context. Looking beyond and more closely at that link to action, we see in the SDGs 3 novel measurement objectives. First, interlinkages and multidimensionality, economic, social, environmental, poverty, child development. Many are regarded multidimensionally, and so we need new metrics. The second is to have an integrated, multi-sectoral, whole-of-government approach, breaking silos. And the third is to leave no one behind, and that requires, in a measurement sense, disaggregating the measures to see the whole distribution, knowing who is the poorest, and then look over time to see if they have been left behind or if they are catching up. And these core ideas have been in the SDG document, Transforming Our World, and beyond. So to give an example from an area I know well of multidimensional poverty, when a core number of SDG indicators are selected, whether it's for the global MPI pictured here or for national MPIs, they often are also the priorities of the national plan. A government cannot perhaps look at all of the SDG indicators, and so they are setting priorities. But what's different about a multidimensional poverty measure and some other approaches is that they start at the household, and they say who is deprived in several of these core priorities at the same time. because they are the most vulnerable, they are the poorest. And if you're only deprived in one indicator, therefore, at a time of fiscal constraints, it might be less demanding politically than if you're deprived in several. And so people are identified as poor if they experience a critical mass of deprivations. And that's important for targeting geographically and at the household level. And an MPI looks at the percentage of people who are poor and the average deprivation load of each poor person. And when you multiply this together, you get a special number. And it's special because it both can give you the level of poverty, which regions or age groups or ethnic groups are the poorest, but also the indicator composition of poverty. And that's what's important because sectoral policies differ in the north or the south, etc., the mountainous versus the coastal areas. And when people have an overview of the composition of poverty, it helps the different sectors to work together. So these multidimensional metrics have been used since 2009 when they became, with Mexico, the first official permanent measures of poverty complementing monetary poverty for a number of different policy uses. I don't have time to go into them, but I would name budget allocation as being essential, targeting the marginalized groups and households as being a very common application from Vietnam to Chile, coordinating policy so that different ministries work together and intersectoral approaches are made reality. Because you can save costs, and that's important in this time of fiscal constraints. And of course, being transparent so that university students learn to compute new metrics and to use them and interpret them with confidence so that the private sector applies them for their own employee base and value chain. So that those working on social bonds look at trajectories of multidimensional poverty or SDG indicators in providing better terms for their bonds. So the aim is to use measures of the SDGs, but to use them in a coordinated, highly efficient, whole of government way, and to use them to design policies that really impact several goals at the same time.
Okay, so we would now open it up to the panelists for their opening remarks. So if we could start with Dayan. So Dayan Shaini, he's a statistician at UNSCAP, and he also co-authors the annual Asia Pacific SDG Progress Report. Over to you, Dayan, for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Sohini. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to speak a little bit about our experience and our work on monitoring the SDGs in Asia Pacific. I'll give a short presentation and then we have some more discussion afterwards. So I'll talk about four different things that are interconnected with our main objective of ESCAP, which is to strengthen the national statistical systems in Asia Pacific. And in the context of the SDGs, we do some work on data availability in assessing progress and doing more localized subnational assessments and also integrating them into national and local plans. First, about the availability of SDG data. You might have seen this graph before, which shows how availability has increased over the years on the 231 indicators of the SDGs in Asia Pacific. However, this increase has stagnated in the last couple of years. So we think that we need to accelerate again the momentum to fill in the data gaps. And when we look at the countries that have the most availability in the top 10 countries in data availability in Asia Pacific, here the top 10 by availability, but I have hidden the names of the countries. And I was going to ask you, can you guess which countries come at the top? Which are the 10 top countries with the most data on the SDGs? Any guess? Bangladesh. Okay, good guess. Yes. Sorry? Switzerland? I'm sorry, this is just for Asia Pacific. Yes. Singapore. Okay, that's an interesting guess. South Korea, also very interesting guess. And exactly what I wanted to hear, because the countries that we see, none of them are high-income countries that have the most data. And that also, it's an important lesson for us to remember that actually most of the developing countries are doing the hard work producing data for the SDGs. And some of the high-income countries are perhaps not thinking that it's their job to also monitor the SDGs. But it is, because the SDGs is for all the countries. So congratulations to these countries that are in the top 10. Where does the data come from on the SDGs? This is a research that we did in ESCAP. We try to find out what are the data sources for the SDGs. And it comes at the top what we call international reporting, which is some sort of a data source which is a combination of national and global reports that it actually informs quite many indicators of the SDGs. And that's followed by the household surveys and administrative data you're probably familiar with. And these are the main sources of data for the SDGs. And as you can see, big data is one of the least important sources for the SDGs currently. But why is data not available? We think that there are 4 different reasons, as you can see on the screen, why SDG data is not available at the national level. And we are very familiar with issues of resource and technical capacity, which normally we hear very often from member states. But interacting with them, we realize that coordination and prioritization actually are the key ones for making data available. Because often the source of the data is there, but due to lack of coordination among the ministries and agencies, and also lack of coordination with the international agencies that are the custodians of the SDG indicators, that doesn't allow the data to be available publicly. And also prioritization. We hear very often from countries that this indicator is not applicable to us. Like, for example, we hear very often that violence against women indicators are not applicable to us because this doesn't happen in our country. But if we ask back, do you have any women in your country? And if they say yes, I find it very hard to justify that this is not applicable. Also other indicators like number of refugees and things like that. Sometimes they are labeled as sensitive indicators. But I think here it's an area where everyone can collaborate to actually change the mindset. And talking about that, we think that there's four different areas that we can do to change the picture on the data gaps. First is to understand where the data gaps are, where there is no data. Second is to do some planning and advocacy for producing the data that is missing. Third, as I said already, coordination. And here coordination in the countries and also with the international agencies. And finally, increase the demand for the data by using the data so that if you use the data, then there is a reason to produce it as well. And here also I'd like to highlight that using also citizen-generated data and sometimes some non-SDG data might be a catalyst for producing data that is official as well. One example was, it happened here in Thailand, was a stakeholder workshop on SDG 16, which is a complex goal because it has data from many different sources. So Thailand brought together officials from several different ministries and agencies that deal with this goal. And together with UN agencies like UNICEF, UNODC, UNESCO, we sat together and discussed this. And so we found common ground on how to produce the data that is missing for Thailand. So this is just one example that I give because the time is short for these opening remarks, but we can discuss more later. I would like to also touch a bit on the assessment, and that's connected with the use of the data. In ESCAP, we realized that the more we use the data, the more there is reason to produce it. And we have been doing over the last 6-7 years of the SDGs, this SDG progress report that you might have seen before. The latest one has shown a picture of the goals in Asia Pacific that doesn't look good. We actually are kind of stagnated in most of the goals, and we're regressing on climate action. And if we were on track, we should be on the line of the 2022. But in none of the goals, we are actually on track. And we realize that doing this regional assessment is excellent, but the closer it connects with where the policy changes can occur, the best will be the results of our assessment. So we decided to first take it to the national level. And so using national data and national targets, we're able to use this tool called National SDG Tracker to create the same assessment for every country in Asia Pacific. And so this is a partnership that we do with governments to do their own progress assessment. And we have done that already in 16 countries in Asia Pacific, or we're in the process of doing. For 7 of them, they have presented the results in New York at the high-level political forum. And we hope that we will extend this to more countries as well. And going even now closer to the grassroots, we thought of how to use this at the subnational level as well. And we have now piloted in one country, in the Philippines, where we did the assessment at the regional level of the 17 regions of the Philippines. And we used a participative approach to analyzing the data, identifying the areas that there are gaps, and then developing, consulting with stakeholders to develop regional and provincial SDG implementation plans. And the Philippines plans to use their funds at the national level to fund exactly the gaps in the regions that are in the most need. This is also very important that it's only possible to do something like that when we have a strong partnership between the National Development Agency in the Philippines is called NEDA, together with the Statistics Office, which is the PSA of the Philippines. This is the kind of analysis we did at the regional level with them. And finally, as Dr. Sabina also said in the video in the beginning, all of this only matters if there's a change in policy, if there's a change in the way that we're implementing the SDGs. So we try to find a way to integrate these insights into the plans that are implemented at the national and subnational levels. And for that, we have a framework called EPIC, Every Policy is Connected, which tries to exactly connect indicators and data with the policies. And this framework takes into account the complexity of issues that may have different dimensions, also the issue of disaggregation of data, because different populations may have different vulnerabilities. And out of that, we try to create a comprehensive indicator framework to monitor national and subnational plans. It's a clear and reproducible methodology that every country can follow, and we provide training to government officials on that. Also, it's a way to foster collaboration between planners, policymakers, and statisticians. That's all I have for the opening remarks. Thank you, Sohin.
Thank you so much, Dan. So I think that was great. I do have a lot of follow-up questions, but I think before we move on to Sonia, I think one follow-up question that I had, because you spoke about the SDG, the tracker work that UNESCAP has been doing. So if you could shed some light on some of the challenges that countries face when it comes to creating a global methodology, and what has been your lesson on that front?
Yes, thank you for this question. Actually, it's funny because in the beginning, when ESCAP started to do this progress assessment, we faced a lot of criticism. Why are you assessing progress? Why are you measuring it? It's not your role. It's the countries are supposed to do it, or headquarters is supposed to do it. And why are you setting targets for the countries? And all these kind of things. But we realized that we have to do some assessment. It's not perfect. There's no best or perfect way to assess the SDGs, but we have something that we can show where the region is and where each country in the region is on the SDGs. Now, there are different ways to assess progress. Perhaps you have seen the work of other organizations like the European Commission and the Sustainable Development Network, SDSN, have come up with different ways to measure the SDGs progress. However, we find that different approaches actually result in different messages and sometimes different results. And that's because they might use different types of data, sometimes not using all the SDG indicators or sometimes using proxy indicators. Also, the way that the progress is calculated might be different with different methodologies. So for us, we always think that what are we trying to measure here? What exactly matters when we're reflecting about the SDGs? And in our mind, we thought that we need to know two things. How much progress we have made from the start of the SDGs and how far are we from achieving the targets. Because these two questions, they reflect on our strengths and what are our gaps, what else do we need to do. So we try to answer them by formulating those charts that you've seen by goal that shows that. So in summary, yes, it is challenging to come up with a methodology for assessing progress on the SDGs, but at the same time, we need to do something and we need to answer these questions. So what ESCAP has done is to facilitate that also for the countries to be able to measure their progress on the SDGs.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Okay, so we can now maybe if we can have Sonia Sandhu to kind of share her opening remarks. So for those of you who haven't attended her other sessions that she has spoken to in the last 3-4 days, Sonia she leads the evaluation capacity development work at the Independent Evaluation Department at Asia Development Bank. And she has also worked with World Bank and the private sector in project management, environmental safeguards, and monitoring and evaluation and knowledge management in her long career. Over to you, Sonia, to share your opening remarks, and if you could talk more about SDG 12 and 13 and
Yes.
and ADB's work on that. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Soini, and I'm just absolutely honored to be part of this panel. So what there's a lot. So Diane, especially, thank you so much for setting the context. And the context is rather large, like it's a big canvas for SDGs. So what I thought I'd do is, just share a bit of different perspectives and just highlight a little bit more about the complexity behind all of the issues that Diane already referred to. And I think what I'm going to share is a mixed bag of some work that ADB's done, some of my own academic works, which I take full responsibility for. But it's, I feel it's relevant, and so I appreciate this chance to share it, and some of the work that I did with ADB as well as and what IED is doing. So to answer the broad question that Soini posed in this panel, the world we want, what is the world we want? It's a world that has quality of life for all. So it's a rather large mandate, big canvas, which we are all responsible for. So the quality of life, clean air, clean land, clean water, that's the essence of livability, whether it's in cities, in rural areas, locally, nationally, regionally, for the planet at large. So I think the SDGs provide a very good framework for that, and Diane's already, highlighted a lot of measurement challenges. So, and I thought I could just take a cue from that, taking a cue from Diane's presentation and the excellent work that's being done by ESCAP on measuring and monitoring. And I must say that ADB's joined hands a lot. There's been a lot of joint knowledge work produced with UNDP, ADB, as well as SCAP on tracking these SDGs, or also on ADB projects. And ADB projects now have a mandatory SDG tracking system, by which the alignment, at least broadly, of each project gets tracked. And that's like the first challenge for cascading large policy dimensions to first a project level, which is challenging in itself. So setting realistic indicators, I think, are really important. And quality of life is underscored by SDG 12 and 13. 12 on responsible consumption, production, natural resources, like I mentioned, land, air, and water largely, and climate action, which many times is beyond our control. So, but the environment and people bear the consequences of what the changes induced by climate change. So the human dimension to these indicators is really strong, and I think that's a very large challenge that I personally, as a project officer designing projects at the World Bank, or even through the safeguards, even through working largely on the urban sector in cities, I found that that context of bringing the 1.5 degrees centigrade to what it means to a person in a city and say, okay, my life is going to be affected by that. It's a huge challenge, and if we want that grassroots level sort of engagement, then it's a challenge for all of us in the development community to help translate that vision into the local context. So localization is not as easy as it sounds. It's different, like Dhyan already mentioned: geography, political economy, culture, behavior. Everything is a composition of localization. It's a huge contextual dimension. Big challenge is policy incoherence. Even after all of these, guidance and directions that the leaders come together and share, the fragmentation of approaches across sectors, the thinking in silos, it's taking a long time to break. And I'm not saying that it's completely not there, but it's still extremely fragmented. And if you bring it down to our level, we all live in cities, we're all citizens, you will see the fragmentation so much. The roads guys don't talk to the water supply guys, the pipes are being put where, without information. So, all of these things, we can actually live it day by day. So that fragmented approach is hard to translate in an indicator or a measure. Of course, capacity limitation largely at the local government, and local government, I think they are at the front line of everything. So though we have national level policies and we have departmental guidance, translating that to the local level, I think is very challenging, and there are huge shortfalls in that. And now working in capacity development, looking at, how to contextualize these rather large to a project program officer who's supposed to deliver his project in 18 months' time, and he has to think about the SDG tracking, he or she. The capacity is difficult. I mean, there are a lot of constraints that local government local government people face, or officers face, and especially where climate is concerned. When you have a disaster, or you have a natural disaster or a cyclone, typhoon, the front line is where then everything vanishes. So the embedding of these what word am I looking? The embedding this thinking process at the local government level continues to be a big challenge. Another challenge of setting proper targets is a mismatch of financing and outcomes. Yes, there's a lot of finance being pouring in, and from the global, there are a lot of funds being set up both for 12 and 13. But how do these translate to outcomes of a project or a program? That targeting, there are a lot of shortfalls. And of course, Dhyan already mentioned the low priority given to management. And to me, management is monitoring and evaluation and learning is all part of good project management. It's management 101. So, and what is missing in that is the perspective of the beneficiary, that citizen, us. How does that get factored in, especially when we bear the consequences of where things are going wrong? Data access and availability, Diane's already mentioned. Again, I would cascade that down to local government. That's really the data source, and those capabilities of harnessing data at the local level, there are huge shortfalls. And of course, I think these shortfalls can be leapfrogged with the use of technology, and not using that is a lost opportunity. So having mentioned the shortfalls and the challenges, I think I don't want it to sound like this dismal thing about, there are many, many, many good things happening, but sporadically. But if we were to use technology better, then the leapfrogging would be easier. A replication of what's working in one area could be in terms of process and outcome can be replicated in other areas. And then, that disaggregation can be aggregated upwards. Challenge of integration. It's not so, integration is a very big word. And SDGs are providing this amazing framework, but 12 and 13, for example, are central to 14, 15, and 16, life below water, governance and institutions, and how things converge with each other. So this is just a visualization map. Please don't take it literally, but it's just the sense of how much coordination is required. And again, I want you to all think at the local level. What does that mean to the local government, where projects and programs actually get implemented? This is just an illustration of, again, some of the work that I did, academically. We don't have, this is, Sohini mentioned the Niti Aayog. This is an illustration from India, where there is an attempt to develop a national, information framework, they call it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So where they are trying to aggregate the various SDG indicators and targets at a sectoral level. And so there's Niti Aayog, which is the apex institution. It's also the public think tank, public policy think tank of the Government of India, and it's instituted for monitoring the SDGs. And India has also developed its own SDG index, which is also owned by Niti Aayog. And Diane already mentioned the association with statistics. So Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, they're a joint partner. They are the channel to basically draw data from various other sectors. And what I tried to do here is look at SDG 12 and 13, look at those indicators, and just take a look at the various sectors that are involved to source data to monitor these two, which are really underscoring quality of life. And this is at the national level. Now, this map would cascade in India, we have 29 states, would cascade to the state level, and then it would cascade to the local level. So it's just to give a sense of how much capacity needs to be built and how many systems need to be updated or enhanced, so that there's a certain sense of collation of this data. And again, in this mapping, I haven't mentioned the people, but the data that we can get from qualitative surveys by meeting beneficiaries on the ground on how they bear the consequences of what's happening with degraded natural resources, with climate-induced increasing frequency of storms, sea level rise. It's another challenge. But challenge which is coming with beginning of solutions. So again, I'm just not trying to highlight the challenge, but just give an idea of what a bridge we have to travel or cross 2030 is not happening. Diane's already mentioned that. So Diane, forgive me for keeping on referring to you, but you actually gave me the context cues for many things. So just taking the localization idea forward, I wanted to share an illustration again. This is my own academic work and front lines of local governments. We have a huge ADB, we have a huge constituency. I mean, the world, there's small island states, there's coastal areas, coastal zones. So this is just basically understanding the local context. And I thought this is a good illustration to highlight the complexity of when we're trying to set up an indicator, we have to understand the realism. And for that, cascade down again, what is really this system made of? So if we just to illustrate, a coastal zone is not just a beach where we go to have a holiday, right? It's actually a land subsystem, coastal subsystem, and ocean subsystem. And you can see the interrelations of what's happening here. There's impacts on estuaries. There's, of course, economic drivers like tourism. We all need that. There's natural transportation of silts, there's erosion, there's all kinds of processes happening. So the idea to illustrate through this is basically we need to understand the geographic system and the people that are within that system, and thereafter as policymakers set up an indicator. So possible solution for how to visualize this integration in that coastal zone, I think we don't take a look at all of these aspects as assets. So again, from an engineering or a planning point of view or a project team person point of view, the total asset management approach helps to find a solution to develop an integrated approach. For example, developing infrastructure in that coastal zone, it would be something like a hybrid infrastructure that looks at gray and green solutions together. May be a possible solution. And thereafter you set indicators. Okay, the gray infrastructure, what could be those indicators that would be derived and contribute to SDG 12 in terms of how resources were consumed, and SDG 13 as well, sea level rise. Do we need to nourish the beach, or we need to build a seawall? What do we need to do at the local level, and who will monitor that? So this is a different type of approach, which is possible solution for that challenge of integrated development that we come up with. IED recently did IED carries out annual evaluation reviews, for every year to look at ADB's performance of projects in terms of relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, and we've heard all of these criteria. So in 2021, IED did a review of progress of SDGs through ADB-assisted projects. And of course, these are just some highlights of the uneven progress in the region, which has already been highlighted. But thing to, a point to note is basically that if current trends continue, then SDG indicators will be worse than what they are in 2015. And clearly the regression of the climate SDG 13 is evidence of that. And also the widening financing gap. I mean, even to reach 2030, there was a huge financing gap. So imagine the increased financing gap if we were to try and escalate or, escalate these. And these are from OECD estimates. So just broad estimates, but then we had the COVID. And so those have added to reprioritize issues. So I know I'm getting into an area which is Sohini's part 2, but I just thought that maybe it will actually set the stage for part 2. So Sohini, allow me 5 minutes more to just finish what I have to say so that we can, have questions or whatever. And so ADB did this is in combination with UNESCAP, this study that was done in 2020 on how can the SDGs be fast-tracked, and really what can policymakers do, and what could possibly be the drivers of transformation. Diane already gave the example of Thailand, which is basically setting a new direction, a reorientation by governments, and they took a leap for that and created a joint initiative by the National Resource Council, Research Council of Thailand. Sorry, I think I've been talking too much the last 3 days. Second point is aligning systems and institutions to address these systemic issues. And I've tried to give you examples of the complexity. But, there are having said that, there are fragmented approaches. Yes, we are institutionally in governments as well as organizations divided in some ways, but somewhere there's an aggregation that happens, and that's important to reconcile. So some examples towards reaching larger goals. 2018, Indonesia issued its first green sukuk Islamic bond and became a front runner in mobilizing Islamic finance for SDG achievement. And these financing models are basically the issue that I mentioned earlier on targeting finance towards certain incomes, certain outcomes. Singapore, in the same token, created another, Singapore is it's a different state, country, whatever. The governance makes a big difference, but nevertheless, there are learnings from Singapore, for startups and venture cap, basically to encourage enterprise at the local level. So, sustaining momentum for change, policymakers, Bangladesh, we already have seen a good example of how they are really trying hard to deliver and actually gathering that data that's so difficult. And they have, come up with the Digital Bangladesh by 21 vision for, streamlining public service delivery. So another good example that can be replicated. And number 4, driver of transformation is policy making. Of course, policy making plays a very important role. But what we've learned from looking at the SDGs so far, it's a very broad guidance, which is great. But how does that then cascade and, sort of give the ingredients for policymakers to improve the quality of the policies, not reinventing the wheel? So look at the trade-offs and look at the complexities. And 12 and 13, because they're so essential for quality of life, I think this is extremely important. So policy coherence, I mentioned the issues related to incoherence. So clearly, policy makers need to start thinking differently. New Zealand is a good example of, taking, driving money where it really needs to be driven. Bhutan, of course, again, created this gross national happiness index. And I actually had the opportunity to visit Bhutan. And it's a small country, so it's easy to talk to people there. And it's amazing how this GNP, the gross national happiness philosophy, has translated to every single citizen. It's, I just found that cascading amazing. And maybe it can be taken up as a study on, how that process of stakeholder engagement was replicated. And of course, I'm actually very proud of this, that just very recently hot off the press. So talking of policy drivers, the G20, the New Delhi Declaration, and look at the emphasis on climate change. And it's very closely integrated with SDG 12 and SDG 13. And that is really a very big transformation transformatory element. Of course, now the challenge would be to cascade this into national and local policies and look at the implementation. And I think if we look at the livability triangle, it's centered with people. And if we look at cascading elements and taking people's voices first, using technology to harness people's voices, I think the implementation might be a step in the right direction. So I'll stop there. And thank you so much, Sohini.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So I think before we move on, I have one follow-up question. So I think you mentioned in your presentation, again, fascinating presentation, you spoke about realistic indicators, right? And what I could think of is in your sector, there is this, there are harder to measure indicators. For example, the indicator of resilience or climate adaptation.
Yes.
So how can we think about these nuances a little bit more systematically?
Yeah, and thank you. Actually, that slide on understanding the coastal zone was precisely to share that, because unless we understand the vulnerabilities, like there's no formula for adaptation, right? There's no formula for this is the nature-based solution that will work, because it is so contextual, and the gestation period for these are very long. So I think, and I'm just thinking at the top of my head, there are no indicators for even, there's vulnerability risk assessments that are being conducted, for example, as part of all ADB projects. But that's only that's limited to assess the risk of vulnerability of that particular project in that particular setting. But from a people's perspective, if I were to say that, okay, am I safe? And am I going to get a public service, say water supply, most essential during a disaster event? I don't think we have the answers for that yet. So Bangladesh, actually, they've done some really good, trade-off analysis, I would think, on looking at issues such as, again, I'm talking about the coastal zones, looking at beach nourishment versus creating, sea banks and things like that. And but again, I think those indicators are highly qualitative. So I'm very conscious I haven't answered your question on what is that indicator. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to really converge and foster this thinking before we can even come up with a realistic indicator for what is the meaning of resilience here. But having said that, I think the total asset management approach and quality infrastructure, these are a few methodologies that are being, these are nothing new. Total asset management is civil engineering 101. It's not a new thing. But when we talk of total asset management, it's not just looking at how a road functions. It's looking at how people would use that road, what happens on its banks, how much flood protection is coming out of it, how are the medians designed, and things like that. So the cultural, physical, and geographical aspect of it has traditionally or conventionally not been taken into account. So one of the indicators would be that is total asset management being conceptualized at the local government level or with public works departments? Is the setting of operation maintenance budgets, for example, including not just grey infrastructure, but the green and the blue and everything. So that could be a feasible indicator for, like, let's look at SDG 12, natural resource consumption. Look at mangroves, again, coastal areas, which are natural shock absorbers. And if we take the total asset management approach, then that becomes a very crucial asset, more crucial than the road that's actually taking us there for tourism, for example. So the indicator would be, are there enough budgets to make sure that mangroves are conserved? I'm not even going to the restoration part. Are conserved, and are people involved in it? Now, cascade further, the incentive for people involvement would be that they gain a lot of livelihood. So rather than gaining livelihoods from wrecking the mangroves, they gain livelihoods from protecting them and contributing again to the economic drivers of tourism. So this integrated thinking, I'm hoping, through a total asset management for a manager at a local level, might give a sense of what those realistic indicators could be.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So if I can request Radhika to share her opening remarks. So just to quickly introduce Radhika. So Radhika Lal is currently the SDG Finance Policy Advisor and Team Lead at UNDP's Bangkok Regional Office. And she leads a team with a portfolio encompassing support to public and private financing for the SDGs and climate action. Over to you, Radhika, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and thanks also for setting the stage so well. Some of you are probably wondering, okay, what is this lady doing here? She's not a data practitioner, right? She doesn't do evaluation. She's not part of any support to statistical offices. The short answer is I'm stepping in for a colleague who could not make it. But more importantly, maybe I'll give a data user perspective, to some of these issues, having worked at the country level. So a lot of what UNDP does, and I think that's where perhaps the power of collaboration comes in, is really the nexus which Diane spoke about of data production and use by national statistical offices, planning, as well as financing. And I think it's from that nexus and that interconnection that I'm going to speak, drawing on some of the actually very powerful experiences with forward-looking national statistical offices in this regard. And one of the biggest challenges I think that countries face, which we've heard about quite a bit, is that the SDG indicators are a mouthful, right? I mean, there are a huge number of things to do, overstretching national statistical offices who already face challenges in collecting data just to monitor their own national development priorities. So one of the biggest things that we often do is to really help make those interconnections. And while global monitoring remains critical, really keep the emphasis on national use, right? What data do you need to support planning, decision-making on national priorities, and wherever possible to make those interlinkages. One of the powerful things that I've seen is that the SDGs have actually, catalyzed work at the national level around much more effective use of administrative data, which was not also being used, effectively nationally. To get much stronger metadata standards, which are not there, to harmonize, to improve, also to look at the interoperability, because once the SDGs, force us to look at interlinkages, right? They are integrated. Even a single SDG indicator has so many different parts to it, which makes life even more complicated, right? You're looking at sustainability dimensions, access, and all kinds of other things in a single indicator. So I think the focus on interlinkages, and at least what I've seen, starts getting at those discussions, fairly technical, around these types of issues of how do you harmonize, how do you make your data interoperable, how do you allow for different types of data to be used together, right, very powerfully. And I think that's been very, very helpful. And also encouraging a culture of data sharing, which sadly we don't have, right? We've heard about the silos, people produce their data, it's on their websites, but national data reporting platforms for the SDGs help us to bring all these different pieces of data together so that we can start to see the interlinkages across data. The other thing which I found very, very powerful in our work is data visualization, right? Statistics is, how should I say, it's not necessarily everybody's forte, right? Some people go to sleep when you see a table, when you see data, right? How do you make data interesting? And I think this is something we don't focus enough on, which is visualizing that, showing, even what, on the basis of current trends, what the trend would look like if it continues. Finding ways to make things accessible. So I think these are ways in which, however much people will say, oh, the SDGs, that's a global agenda. We have our national agenda. It's actually helped to bridge that, starting to change data culture, which I think is actually quite important. Also, since I work on finance and on the intersection of planning, one of the other things there which has been helpful is linking data production, SDG indicators, to then alignment of national priorities to the SDGs and seeing how those indicators actually help you track those things, and then linking it to financing. So a lot of support to SDG budget tagging so that you can start to see the continuum across these three, right? You can start to ask questions around, is expenditure that's happening on health or education the most impactful, right? Based on what's happening with the indicators. And now we can start to do that because we can see where expenditure is going, what the results are, and then, also the focus on what needs to change in planning, what needs to change in some of these other things. And I think that's actually a very powerful linkage. But I think we've also heard that data is political, right? I was surprised at some of the indicators you mentioned, but now we have an increasing number of indicators where countries just simply don't update their data, right? Because the numbers probably look bad, post-COVID, post all these polycrises and other things we've been happening. And some of those biggest ones are around employment, youth unemployment, some of those issues, right? So how do we create a culture not only of data sharing, of openness, but the ability to have discussions on the basis of seemingly bad numbers, right? How do we increase the confidence level that this is not, a death knell, it's the basis of a conversation of what we could do differently. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. There's not a lot of data protection. And I think those are some things which are actually quite frightening, right, at country level. Another thing which we found very powerful is, and this was fairly new to, some of the statistical offices and people we worked with, is the importance of open data, right? Open data platforms, other things like that. And partnerships to build that, partnerships to expand the use of different types of data, in complementary to official data, I think, which was also referred to. And we can go into various examples of that. In terms of process, at least in my experience, 2 things or 3 things which were helpful. One was setting up data advisory committees which bring all the line ministries and the NSO together, for example, to foster this type of coordination we've been talking about, and also showing them how their data is being used by others, right? So it's not only coordination and production, it's understanding how your data is being used, and also what data you need for your work, and how those complementarities can be strengthened and aligned with that SDG data roadmaps. This was something that was started also by the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which also ignited all kinds of partnerships around different types of data and how they could be integrated, complementary to official data. And on the side of the UN, we tried to do the same thing. So, for example, I led, the UN in one of the countries, the UN data group, which mirrored that structure, so that we too could coordinate in our support to line ministries and the NSO, and start to look at those interlinkages, that coordinated support, so that, on both sides there was coordination. And I think those are some things that perhaps are useful. So it's not just the role of the NSO, which is absolutely critical, but seeing them as part of an ecosystem. And how do we strengthen that on all sides, to do this in a way that fosters data collaboration, that fosters that kind of joint engagement around, what data do we need, how is it being used, and how can we strengthen that? So given that there's just 30 minutes or less left, let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Radhika. You have given us a lot of food for thought. I think one question that I have is, I really like how you present your thinking around data use. And you made this very powerful statement that data is political. So I think I want to probe a little bit on that. So UNDP does a lot of work on institutionalization of SDGs, and that is always a very resource-intensive endeavor, right? So if you could share some light on how we can think about their agenda that can transcend beyond the 2030 agenda, and how do we think about doing that?
So I think it goes back to the point that I was making, is that you don't want to see the SDGs as something separate, right? The reason they became the first integrated global agenda, development agenda, is because many of those issues resonated, right? The health, the education, but also I tend to think of the SDGs as being a canary in the gold mine, right? It sort of put sustainability, economic, social, environmental, on the map before it was understood and accepted, right? Before people understood, ESG or environment, social governance in terms of private sector investment and decision-making and compliance, the SDGs had put that on the map. So I think the question is really helping to translate that into something that's owned nationally. So then it won't matter, okay, we've, 2030 is come or gone, but it becomes something that's internalized. And for me, that's actually the work that we need to do, is to say, it's absolutely critical that we need to internalize the sustainability agenda, whatever form it takes. And there will be some indicators, some things which will drop by the wayside, and others which will become much, much more critical. Perhaps, much more work around climate and environment. It won't be seen as a single goal, right? It's in fact part of the overall agenda. We should not be doing anything now without really looking at climate responsiveness. Whether it's building of infrastructure or it's thinking about, planning of urban, our vision of what urban looks like or anything. So, I think a lot of it is really how do we take forward that sustainability agenda, whether we 2030 and beyond. But in terms of financing, and this goes back also to data being political, we've also heard and we know that, development partners do a lot of the financing in many countries. Not all, and certainly in this region there's a lot more national financing of data, but in many countries donors are still critical. How do you get governments to see this is important, that they need to finance, right? And I think that's where we need to spend a lot more effort to show this is important for you, right? This is useful for you to have these things to build up and strengthen and actually fund your national statistical offices, which tend to be underfunded in many cases. And that's why a lot more of the focus needs to be on really strengthening the use, the understanding, the accessibility of that data through this transformation of data culture. But when it comes to data being political and how do you build that culture, I think, and we've seen it in some countries, that there is much more open engagement around data. People want credible data. Experts will engage on it. How do we create that culture, right? That you don't want data to be hidden, but you want it to be the basis of collective discussion, and those are hard issues. It goes beyond the work of statisticians. It's a broader political culture issue that we need to look at. And on that, I don't have an easy answer.
Great. So I think I do want Dan to kind of come in here, because I think, Radhika, you mentioned about the different types of data. And I think, Dan, in your presentation, you made this very interesting observation about big data being the least source of SDG data. So if you could talk a little bit about increasing the utilization of innovative methods like remote sensing, AI, machine learning, and how we can think of integrating them into the existing statistical systems, considering that we also touched upon how the statistical systems need strengthening to begin with.
Thank you. Yes, about big data and what we may actually group together as what we call non-traditional data sources, which include remote sensing and satellites, and other types of big data sources. There is a lot of excitement around that. And I, for one, I come from a technology background, and I'm very excited about these new technologies as well. However, what we see in terms of actual monitoring of the SDGs and of sustainable development, they have very, very small contributions to make so far. Perhaps in the future they might become bigger, but right now, for most of the indicators of the SDGs, we really rely on survey data, on administrative data, and the integration of them. As a colleague of mine has said, a colleague from International Labour Organization, ILO, said, we still haven't invented a satellite that can tell how many unemployed in the country and if they're men or women or their age. So while we don't have that kind of satellite, we really have to rely on survey. And therefore, I also wanted to make the point that from what Radhika just said on the importance of the indicators themselves. The indicators of the SDGs, if you know the indicators, you'll also have mixed feelings about them. Some are good indicators, some are not as good. Some of them, they don't really measure what we want to achieve. And we realize that the indicators are actually a very important piece, and it's the common ground between statisticians, policymakers, planners. And so the formulation of the indicator, the process of coming up with the indicators is key, is central for any kind of endeavor. And we find that having stakeholders around the table together, the producers of data, the users of data, and other stakeholders should be the driving force on the design of the indicators, and especially to determine what kind of populations and groups are most affected by them, and so that we also can design the level of disaggregations that are needed to monitor the certain policy objectives. Therefore, I really want to emphasize that this kind of conversation around indicators is really very important.
Great. So I have one last question before we open it up for audience Q&A. So on your point about indicators, right, and how to kind of strengthen them. So I think I would request Radhika to kind of come in here because I think one aspect that we have seen in the report this year, the SDG report of 2023, is that there are 83 indicators that do not have enough data set yet. So how can we think of improving the precision of SDG monitoring, and what is UNDP's work, how is UNDP working on this aspect?
I mean, I think this comes back to the point. Sorry, I think this comes back to the point that Diane was just making, that countries prioritize data, right? And some of them, I mean, one would have to unpack these 83 indicators which don't have data to see, is it likely that they will get data because, through various methodologies, openness to use of big data or non-traditional data, or do we need at some point better indicators, right? I mean, I think we can't have that discussion without looking at the granularity of these issues, and maybe you have a better sense of these 83 and other things. But I think a lot of the work is done at different levels with the global, the UN statistical agency. I'm blanking out now, and also the work of the IAEG and other groups which look at these issues around the different tiers of indicators, sources of data, how do you combine them, how do you refine them, and that whole process goes on particularly at the global level for global monitoring. At the national level, the support is really around how do you make also those indicators useful for national monitoring. So in some of the countries we've worked in, the global, you may not have data for the global indicator, but you may find that there is nationally relevant data for a tweaked indicator for the national level, and I think that's where our emphasis is, because that's the one that's going to be used, right? What's nationally relevant, and trying to get that synergy between global and national is important, but it's, the priority needs to be on national use, and then finding ways to harmonize for global reporting. And I wanted to just make one point, picking up on the imagery of what you can and not do, but is this business of combining data. I mean, one thing that I didn't speak enough of, and I think which is critical, is just visualizing geospatial disparities, right? And I think that's where combining satellite data and big data of various types starts to give us really an image of what those disparities can often look like. I think we're all familiar with the sort of images of lights, right? Where you see New York just lit up no matter what time of the day, and you see other areas where there is nothing, right? I mean, whole parts of continents where there is literally nothing. I mean, and those are also very powerful images of disparity, and how do we get at that? And I didn't speak about the work of, at the subnational level, and in India, for example, of SDG, state-level SDG units, others which start to get at much more subnational granular data, and again, this, the ability to combine them to inform decision-making.
One very small point, Soini, if you'll allow. I think to all this conversation of data, especially for 12 and 13, if you just, again, I want to cascade it down to people. And communities can be a very strong source of data. And, in the last COP, we had this big financing, targeted financing for protection of damage from for life and property, right? And that's really the implication on people. So people could be, and people could be users of data, demand for data, and also sources for data.
Great, thanks. So I think I keep saying this, but one last question that I have, and we have been talking about data use. So I just wanted to bring in the policymaker perspective. So for those, we have been speaking a lot about the work that DMU and Niti Aayog has been doing in India. So we have with us Mr. Akhilesh Kumar. He's the director of DMU at Niti Aayog, and Niti Aayog is really the nodal authority for SDG implementation in India. So Akhilesh, if we can go to you next, and then we will really hear from you. So Akhilesh, if you could talk a little bit about the work that DMU is doing towards, and Niti Aayog particularly is doing towards SDG localization. And considering that, when we think about localization, we are thinking at a very, very granular level. So how are policymakers, dealing with this challenge of data availability and quality as you strive towards monitoring SDGs at such a granular level? And what are some of the strategies that you are thinking of adopting to ensure that evaluations remain accurate and comparable?
Thank you. I think there are three components in these questions. One is regarding the strategy of the Government of India in localization of SDGs. Second is the creation and development of a monitoring framework in the country. And third one is the issue and challenges relating to the data availability for the SDG indicators. For the first component, through the highest level of decisions, which is a cabinet resolution in India, which we know every highest decisions is basically taken on the basis of cabinet note. So SDG was adopted in India on the basis of the cabinet note resolution, the way back when it was adopted by all the country in 2015. And following which, on the basis of the global consultations, national indicator frameworks, and the strategy for the localization of SDG has been started. India has presented two VNR report in HLSC. This shows our commitment towards the implementation of the SDG. And three agencies in India, basically, the Niti Aayog, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementations, and Ministry of External Affairs were identified as a nodal agency to carry forward these tasks, and achieve the given tasks by 2030. Niti Aayog, with overall responsibility of coordinations and implementation of SDG, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation with the responsibility of development of robust data systems for addressing the SDG data requirement, and also for creation of national indicator frameworks. And MEA is basically, obviously, for carrying the tasks of international commitments and coordination among all the member countries. So given these tasks, India has started and the implementations. As of now, since last 3 years, this, okay, on the basis of these tasks, Ministry of Statistics has developed national indicator framework, taking clue from the global indicator framework. Right now, we have nearly 284 national indicators in our frameworks, out of which we could adopt ditto global indicator, that is number in, I think, nearly 70 or 80. And for the 50 global indicator, partial data is available in our systems. This is all about the national indicator framework. On the same premises, we also aspire to develop the similar framework at the subnational level, which is state levels, then below districts level, and also below the village level. So all these states and UTs except Ladakh have state indicator framework. They are working on this. And some states, take lead in these directions. They have developed district level indicators, and some of states have developed, village level indicator framework. Right now, this year only, this financial year only, Ministry of Panchayati Raj, basically this ministry take leads in taking, taking care of local level rural bodies in India. They developed local indicator framework so that all the activity can be synchronized at the panchayat level. So this kind of the commitment we have in making this process as a whole of government approach at the various level of governance, through which we are aspiring to achieve this thing. And so far as issues and challenges regarding the data availability is concerned, there are lots of issues and challenges. If you see the number of, we have 169 targets, but all these targets are not relevant to the country specific. So the target which we found as relevant to India, we adopted the same targets. But again, within the target, we have number of indicators in which it requires lots of efforts in data collections. There are many indicators which are tracer indicators. That means one indicator have number of sub indicators. So these are the kind of sort of challenges before us. To address these challenges, we align our existing large-scale survey like NFHS, periodic labor force survey, socio-economic survey with the data requirement of SDG. India also started collecting new data systems, like we have just recently started multi-indicator survey, which is in line with multi-indicator cluster survey of UNICEF. So basically, UNICEF also have provided support in this direction. So all these things, basically, we are trying to, develop data systems in India. One interesting things which I like to share here is that every country has data issues in respect of their management, their governance, and the quality issues. In India, we also found the same things across all the ministry and departments. So to resolve this issue, we started one framework, which is a data governance quality index framework. So the main aims of this framework is to improve the administrative data quality among all the ministry and departments, interoperability of the data, and the use of data also. Many departments were collecting data and not using data at all. So we made these efforts to also improve the system there. I hope I addressed all.
Thank you so much. And we at Clear South Asia were actually a technical partner of DMU on the data quality indicator, the index that.
If you allow me, then one more point I would like to
very quickly in under 1 second.
Evaluation is standalone activities. In India also, we take evaluations either at the mid-course of the scheme implementation or at the end of the scheme implementations, primarily to see the course corrections requirements or the impact which is generated by the our intervention or the schemes. But to make a continuous process there, two important initiatives taken by the Government of India. One is a implementation of output outcome monitoring framework, in which the allocation of resources are clearly mapped with the output and an outcome of the schemes. And to measure that output and outcomes, we developed measurable indicators. And every year, so we ministry, the implementing agency, has to identify the targets against each indicators, and we monitor the compliance of the targets. We take annual meeting with all the ministry and departments under the highest, decision-making authority, which is a vice chairman and member Niti Aayog. They take these meetings and review the progress of the schemes. So this make an evaluation as a continuous process. So my suggestion to all country may be that they may also started, making this as an, the continuous process in their systems. Second things which we suggested the implementing agencies to adopt is social audit. So last year, we also recommended some statistical methodology in implementing the social audit. So social audit is basically driven by the concerned implementing agencies by involving the different stakeholders to improve the performance of these schemes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, if we can maybe get one or two questions before we close the panel. So any burning questions that any of you have? Yes, please go ahead. So, yeah.
Yes, good morning. I'm happy to know that the Philippines is among the leading producer of SDG indicators. But again, I think that mainly these SDG indicators are at the results or outcome level. And that's what also we have our plans. Somehow it includes SDG indicators in the results matrix of the Philippine Development Plan. But again, I think what is important is that not only to see how we are progressing, but to really do something in order to fast track our progress. And that is really to come up with indicators that would guide us in order to find the right intervention, like when it comes to the identification of programs, projects, and the allocation of budget. I think there are, Kowar talks about the logical framework of the input, output, outcome. But unfortunately, I'm looking at the experiences and the documentation. Is basically, the documentation is limited at the results. And we would like to know, we would like to establish systems that would help us fast track our achieving those results by effectively monitoring and evaluating our intervention when it comes to programs, activities, and projects. And I'm really looking at systems that provides us that other countries can look and apply in our situation. So I'm really hoping that we can work more on that, really to help establish the system of identifying strategic indicators, because there are a lot of indicators, but there has to be strategic. In fact, we talk about resource-based budgeting, and when I look at the indicators of performance, it's just number of meetings attended, number of meetings held. How will we relate to the results and the outcomes that we'd like to achieve in the SDGs?
Good.
So I think that is important that we have to look into.
Okay. Any other questions? Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. And this is the last question. Sorry, go ahead. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Catalina Salazar from UNICEF. And as an evaluator, I'm always in front of these questions on how well is the project or the program aligned to the SDGs. And for me, this question is very easy to answer. But then when it comes to really fit into what you are saying on indicators, how from the evaluator side can we contribute with evidence and in a systematic way and in a very effective way, so that we can find on every evaluations a chapter or a section that specifically reports on SDGs. So for me, we are missing this opportunity, and I would like to know how can we improve and make evaluations in this last mile, contribute to the evidence that you are missing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So I think the first question, if we can request Dan to come in, because I know that the global indicator framework does use a combination of both input and outcome level indicators, but how can we, to link to his question, how can we move more towards outcome level indicators and be systematic about it? So if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, just a very short comment on that, which is, I think it's very clear by the end of this panel that there's many challenges in the region in terms of monitoring and evaluating the SDGs, and especially the member states, the countries are at the center of it. And we think that there is a lot of capacity development that is still needed in really using all these tools and understanding how to monitor in order to for us to get a better picture of the SDGs. So the example given of the Philippines is not just in the Philippines, but across many countries. And I think the key is to partner with the UN. Actually, we are working together with NED and PSA. But again, build on the knowledge of UNDP or UNICEF and others to really boost the capacity of monitoring SDGs in the countries.
Okay, thanks so much. And I think, Radhika, if you can.
I actually wanted to ask Mr. Kumar a question on that, because some of the national reporting platforms, and I think India started that, but I don't think we're doing it anymore, was actually mapping all the different schemes to the indicators, right? So those effectively were the inputs to realize those outcomes. And then also the budget, right? So this is where the platform should really connect, so what are we doing to achieve that indicator? How much resource are we putting in so that we can start to unpack, is it a resource issue? Is it the fact that the programs are targeting different goals, maybe some more relevant for national, but not that? Or, to begin to have that discussion. So I think it's not just a question of what input indicators we use or output indicators we use, but also really how whatever we're doing actually is working to contribute to that.
Yes.
But I think India moved away from that mapping of schemes and budgets to the outcomes, right? In the national reporting platform, or am I missing something?
In 2017 only, India has mapped all the major schemes with
Yeah.
SDG. And to take further this mapping at the states and states level, similar kind of mapping also has done by the many states like Assam, Haryana, and so on and so forth. Basically, they not only map these schemes with SDG, but also, as Radhika said, also they map the requirement of allocations toward the particular SDG in their area of activities. Towards your questions regarding the quality of indicators, concerns, in India, basically what we are doing is we are using the log frame approach to break the schemes in the different components and also identify the level of, the movement from input to activity, then output, then outcome, and then impact. And to measure this effectively, we follow the SMART indicator approach. The acronym of SMART is basically acronym for specific, measurable, and so on and so forth. And similarly for the remaining the acronyms also we have. So basically, by following these things, we identified set of large number of indicators, and we picked some quality indicator among the identified component and the indicator sets. And whatever system you have in your country, you make your framework as an evolving in nature. Even if you see the global indicator framework, last comprehensive review was done in the year 2020, and next is, I think, going to be in 2025. So similarly in India, we are doing the same every year. But in doing so, we also keep in mind that our key indicators should not change, because this will help you to have some consistency in analyzing data through time series, data points. So this approach we are using for the indicator things, and as we said earlier, we have already mapped, and also some states have mapped their budget allocation as per the SDG targets and goals.
Thank you so much. And Sonia, if you want to respond to the evaluation.
Yeah, very
question.
quickly because we are out of time.
Yeah.
On the project granularity, actually, from our perspective at ADB, we do use the OECD criteria for sustainability, especially, and so there is a lot of room in that criteria to actually assess, the granular impact of what some SDG alignment. The sustainability criteria, as well as now OECD also has a criteria on policy coherence. So although ADB has not adopted it yet as part of our guidelines, they are still in revision, but policy coherence, the criteria actually enables you from an evaluation perspective to look at the counterproductivity of projects in a certain geographical space, and also whether projects are being complementary to each other or not. So that's another lens to use from an evaluation perspective at a project level.
Thank you so much to the panelists. That's all we have from our end. And thank you so much. And I'm so sorry for keeping you from tea. Thank you so much for joining the session.